I guess I want to get a show of hands, and it's going to be interesting to see what we uncover. But how many startups or early stage companies are in the room? Can you raise your hand? So very few. I know there's a couple out there. Now, how many are corporates or investors looking for innovative technologies? Can you raise your hands? Okay. So we got a little bit more on that side. And I wondered if that was the case. We do have some startups come through here, but we mostly have major corporates, utilities, and others. So when I started Clean Edge, actually some of the very earliest work that we did was work with very early stage companies. It wasn't a great business model. I think we got a little bit of equity in a number of companies, some which you have heard of, like Mia Soleil and others, and nothing really came of it. But it's a very brutal and difficult thing to go from a startup to scalability, to be embedded. And what's really different about today from 20 years ago is that you have major corporates and you have utilities, and as we'll learn, you have oil companies and major energy majors who are now active in this space. So I'm really excited about the panel that we have here today. So Wade Bitaraf is with Plug and Play Technology Center. You're going to learn a lot about what they're doing, but they help connect major corporates with a lot of the innovative companies that are coming up, and they do it globally. We have Dr. Emily Reichert, who heads up Greentown Labs. How many of you have heard of Greentown? Greentown Labs is the largest clean tech incubator in the US or North America?
North America.
And so she sees hundreds of companies. And we have Ben Pickard. And Ben is with National Grid Partners, which is the venture arm of National Grid. So we really have the whole ecosystem here from people making connections, people within a utility that are making investments, and of course, Emily in an incubator environment. So I want to just jump in, and I'll open up to questions from the audience as well. But Wade, I hadn't heard about Plug and Play until I met you at the Clean Tech Forum.
Yeah.
And now I see you everywhere.
Because you follow me on LinkedIn.
Well, because you do a lot of LinkedIn, yeah. But they connect large corporates all over the globe with early stage companies on breakthrough innovations. And I guess my question to you now, as I've learned more about what you do, and I'm excited to learn even more today, what would you say is most driving corporate interest and activity in clean energy and what we cover here, grid modernization today? And obviously there's some things that you could think of: climate concerns, access to lower cost energy sources, long-term competitive positioning, all of the above. What are the drivers that you're seeing?
All of the above. And let me just start by thanking you for inviting me. And it's incredibly exciting to be here. When I first met you, I didn't really much know about the gridCONNEXT. By the way of introduction, Plug and Play, what we do, we invest in early stage companies, an active early stage investment firm in Silicon Valley. Last year, we made about 220 investments, and we built up a portfolio of total of 900 startups. And I lead our energy practice there, working closely with utilities and oil and gas companies and that value chain. And then secondarily, we augment and replace a good amount of scouting and venturing efforts of nearly 350 large corporations around the world in 34 locations. Our energy practice started back in California, and it's now branched out to China, Japan, Europe, and very recently to Houston. Yeah, and then to your question, there's a lot of thought leaders here who spoke today on the stage about the need to innovate in the energy sector to reduce the carbon footprint and environmental footprint. So a lot of our scouting efforts, our investment decisions are driven by the needs of these large corporations who partner with us, and that really motivates our investment thesis.
And we'll get into this more, but can you tell me a little bit more about how you go out and do the scouting and make the connections, just very briefly how that works?
Absolutely. So in each of the locations, we kind of understand what are the needs and priorities of these large corporations, and the team that's distributed globally will, a combination of both outsourcing and receiving inbound applications. We review it using our own angel vetting mechanism, and then when it comes to the last mile due diligence, we kind of make about 40 or 50 of these startups, clients available to them and collect feedback from them. And that really is when we finalize our investment decision, and then see what the industry indications are.
So Emily, I mentioned earlier the largest clean tech incubator in North America. Can you tell us a little bit more about how the lab works? And I'm interested in the word lab, because that means you guys are
Absolutely.
probably building stuff. And how you work with these early stage companies and your general partners. Like, how does it play out?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to start, as we're on the topic of corporates, of just giving a shout out to Ben from National Grid. National Grid is a supporter of Greentown Labs, as is NG. And I believe Ken Cohen spoke earlier today. I'm not sure if he's tomorrow. Yeah. Okay. We'll speak tomorrow. But the question is, how does Greentown Labs work with companies and focus on lab there? So as Ron said, we're the largest clean tech incubator in North America, and we're located in Somerville, Massachusetts, which is just outside of Boston. And Somerville is to Boston as Brooklyn is to Manhattan, if that means anything to folks. It's kind of where the startups want to live, work, and play. We have a 100,000 square foot facility now across 3 buildings. It's really a campus, and in it we have 100 plus resident startups who have space with us, but are also part of a really big and powerful community, all working on clean tech. We're a mission-based organization. We don't take equity in the startups. Our goal is really to get the technology out into the world where it can make an impact at scale. And that's another reason why we work so closely with corporate partners, is really they're the answer to that, as I'm sure everyone on this stage would agree. We support companies who are at the seed stage of investment. Typically, they've raised $50,000 all the way up to a couple million, and we support them through Series A, which is usually 5 to 15 million. And that stage, really they're doing a couple of different things. One is that they are taking a prototype that they may have built in the lab somewhere, maybe at a university campus, and they are testing that in a real world environment. And they have to go from making 1 to making 1,000 or 10,000. And that 1,000 or 10,000 being tested is what allows them to typically raise that Series A round. And they need to do that with a first customer. And so a lot of what the work Greentown does is really connecting them with those first customers, who are mostly going to be large corporate entities, like utilities, like the energy majors, who are really very important to getting this technology at scale. In terms of the lab piece of what we do, we are hardware oriented. As it turns out, many clean technologies, so whether you're talking about energy storage or other things that you need to work on in order to make the grid more efficient, they happen to have a device or a piece of hardware that needs to be developed, usually software too, but we've really developed a set of resources that is specially really curated to support hardware-based companies. And so we have 40,000 square feet of prototyping laboratory space, very flexible. Startups can come in. There's a shared machine shop, a shared electronics shop, shared design software that they would have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for, they get for free. And another thing that we're able to offer to them is help with setting up their supply chain for the first time. So we work with them, connecting them to a number of manufacturers and partners, and that helps them get on their way to make that first 1,000 or 10,000 products. As well, we connect them to investors. We work with a network of about 100 investors, corporate partners, as I've already touched on. And the end of the day, these companies are typically not going to go to IPO. They are going to be B2B. And so a lot of the work Greentown does is really helping those relationships be built. And we run a special kind of accelerator program within our incubator called Greentown Launch that is all about a 6-month intensive program where we connect startups with corporate partners, and we see 60% of partnerships formed at the end of that 6-month period for all startups that go through it. So that's kind of a specialty area of ours, and we've been very successful, have run about 8 programs now, and we'll be currently running 4, we'll be running 7 more next year with a lot of different corporate partners.
And before we go to Ben, real quick, if you know offhand, obviously clean tech is a very large umbrella. How much would you say is in sort of the renewable energy storage grid arenas? Those are a lot of sectors, but
yeah,
is it the majority?
That's big
or?
and broad,
Yeah.
but I'd say it's about 40%.
Okay, and the rest is water, materials,
water,
recycling.
waste, agriculture. We have companies that are in transportation mobility,
Got it.
We have
Make it-
a variety of companies that also are doing platform technologies like materials, robotics even if you're making manufacturing more efficient, and as well IT and digital. So really spans the gamut of clean tech.
Thank you. Ben, at NGP, it's the corporate venture arm. You guys are going out and making investments. Real quick, before I go into that, how much have you invested to date?
We're probably, it depends on how you count, but we have a $250 million fund to deploy over roughly 3 years. We've been going at it about 18 months, so,
Okay,
and
about
we're
halfway.
probably about halfway through that capital, maybe a bit less.
So I was reading your mission statement, so I'll repeat it here, and that your mission is to anticipate and accelerate the transition, not surprisingly, to a digitalized, decentralized, decarbonized energy system.
And I learned today there are more Ds there.
Yeah, you can go to 5,
Yeah.
maybe more. Can you tell us some more about the companies you've invested in and some of those investments that you've made?
Sure,
Yeah.
absolutely. Just stepping back really quick, Ron, thanks so much for having me here. Great day so far. National Grid is a multinational utility. We're a not an oil. We're a natural gas and electric. That's the one thing we're not really. Natural gas and electric pipes and wires company. So we run the transmission system, the bulk system for gas and electric in the UK, and then we're essentially a distribution utility in the Northeast, so Massachusetts, New York, Rhode Island. We decided about 2 years ago that we were not doing enough to face a lot of the challenges that we're seeing just by virtue of the changing supply in the grid, as well as more DG coming online. We've also, I think, had to confront some really strong political will and desire to decarbonize. So California is certainly a leader. Both the UK and New York State are looking to net zero their economies by 2050. So potentially, even a step beyond that. In response to that, we have invested in becoming a renewable energy platform ourselves. We bought a developer called Geronimo Energy. We also started this thing called National Grid Partners. Partners is a venture company. We also have a thing called Ventures, which is our non-regulated business. The nomenclature is confusing, but this is National Grid Partners. We're a venture fund. We're also the global innovation function of National Grid. So we've incorporated a lot of some of the more disparate innovation functions are now all running through the same group that's doing venture investing, that's encouraging partnerships with startups. So it's really a rethinking of the way that utilities are approaching innovation, trying to be more outside in many ways in terms of incorporating innovation. The way that we look at investment, the head of National Grid Partners is a lady named Lisa Lambert, who comes to us by way of the Wesley Group, and before that, Intel Capital. She's hired, not exclusively, but several investors also from that Intel Capital world, who really have taken on that corporate VC mold. I have maybe been overexposed to Intel Capital, but if you stand around those guys long enough, they'll tell you that they really perfected a certain recipe for CVC. I think what that means for us in practice is that everything that we invest in needs to have a financial return. So we're looking at typical venture returns where it's a very risky proposition, and you're looking for returns at least in the mid-20s, and if we're honest, we're shooting for higher than that in terms of IRR. The other thing that we need to do for all our investments, in addition to that venture return, is to see strategic engagement with one or more of our business units. So each one of our investments, we want them to actually be doing business with something from National Grid, either immediately or in future. I think
That's how you make your investment decision, partly.
yeah, it's really, we have both of those tests. And it's possible that some of the things that we invest in may be more future focused. So we invested in a deep technology company, which is maybe a bit atypical for us, but a deep technology company called Audio Analytic that provides sound detection. So as a library of sound detection, similarly to how you might ask Alexa or your Google Home device for, they may recognize your voice. You can recognize glass breaking or a dog barking or an alarm going off. We're not in the home speaker or home device business too much today, but you can imagine how that might inform what the relationship between safety and energy and customer and utility might be down the line. Sort of closer to home and something that is more directly, utility applicable would be something like Copperleaf, which is more of a mature business, so a gross, what you'd call growth stage. They already have product market fit, a number of utility engagements. They're really doing a great job. They're based out of Vancouver. They provide a investment analytics engine for utility. So infrastructure-heavy companies, all these different divisions fighting for CapEx dollars, all these different sort of considerations. How do you formalize that? And then how do you kind of create more of a science around deploying capital?
So perfect segue to my next question, which is, when I think about the utility industry, and this is, a broad generalization, that in many cases is a highly regulated industry. It's different in different countries as well. I remember talking to a utility once about getting some clean energy embedded. This is many years ago. And they're like, yeah, you're going to have to 1,000 different lunches with us to get it in. And I mean, they were just kind of giving this feeling of the old utility where you have to go back again and again and again and build a relationship. So when you look at the utility space today and you look at the companies that you're trying to incubate, how do you look at that idea that these are highly regulated industries that maybe move a little slower? And I wonder, maybe we could start with you, Wade.
Sure.
How do you guys view that? And
Sure. So from my perspective, the regulatory landscape is subject to change. Just look at Japan, what happened in the past 3 years. Since 2016, when Japan deregulated their generation, and as of next year, the entire value chain from generation, transmission, and distribution will be fully deregulated. And since then, there's been about 260 energy providers, and that completely changed the paradigm in the opportunities that they can bring in and have a differentiator in their energy providers and energy producers. So I would say the utilities that we work with, the ones that are in the regulated market, they're preparing for the changes in the future, as well as building a better relationship with their customers. One of our recent cohorts where we looked at a company that works on behavioral analytic tools for the utilities on the East Coast that can help kind of identify customer acquisition opportunities and the territories that they can tap into. And obviously in the non-regulated markets, the landscape there is much broader.
are you drawn to more than one over the other in terms of regulated versus deregulated markets?
Well, so just taking a step back, we run 12 industry-specific verticals.
Right.
And then half of my job is to pull the resources from these, opportunities and resources and connect them with the utilities. And in our non-regulated utilities sector, we work much closely with our brand and retail practice that are working around human-centric innovation. We work a lot more closely with our mobility practice, where automakers and OEMs and manufacturers in the automotive space are working. But in our regulated space, we're a little bit more, closer with our cybersecurity space, and a little bit with our energy practice, where, a lot of the things that they share in common can be exchanged among themselves and co-develop technologies together.
Emily, some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd say I would put too shiny a face on it. It's actually really hard for startups to work with, especially the regulated side of these businesses. When we can, I think, well, we look at two things. One is, just the overall posture and direction of a utility. I mean, there are certainly some big, I'd say, leading champions in terms of where they're going with net zero and new technology. A lot of those are in the middle of the country, which is interesting. Excel, I think, would really shine out there. And so you see that there are some companies that have realized that they need to go in a certain direction and are going to innovate to change that. And they need the innovation, and so then the conversation gets much easier. We've actually had more success working with utilities outside the US. Enel, in particular, has an innovation hub located at Greentown Labs. And they've decided they are getting rid of anything to do with oil and gas, and they need the technology to be able to do that. And so they are innovating on every possible direction you can imagine that would need kind of new technology to it to be applied to it. So, I think there's kind of an overall posture that we look to when selecting partners, and also working with the non-regulated side of the business in the U.S., like National Grid, I think would be the best
And I don't know what it says
startups.
for our audience here, but it's interesting to hear Japan, fully deregulating market, NL, Shell, you get these European companies that are getting very active. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the US. And is it NLX or NL?
NL is actually.
Okay, perfect. Ben, how about?
Yeah, so I would say it certainly is challenging, particularly if you find a business that is simply, their business plan is we're going to enter utility RFPs, show them our solution, talk to them for 18 months, and maybe we have a 1 in 3 shot of getting it, then as an investor, you do have to scratch your head and say, well, I don't know if we're gonna hit goal number 1 in terms of making our money back and then some. I think some of the ways that we have approached that is from an investing perspective. There's a whole lot you can do on the enterprise level to improve technology for the utility in a way that is going to bring down the cost of service so if you can make the utility run more efficiently in its finance and its back office and the way it's dealing with billing, potentially its CIS system, all that good stuff, it has a real, it's not just sort of empty technology investing. At the same time, that company that you're investing in can attack multiple verticals. So they can be doing things in banking or finance. So an example of that would be cybersecurity, certainly, where we've made a couple of investments. AI and machine learning would be another where a company we've invested in, Spark Cognition, is not only doing things with wind turbines and predictive maintenance, but also embedding in technology companies like Boeing to incorporate machine learning across a stack. The other way, frankly, that we're trying to address it is I guess, 2 ways. One is internally, culturally, and some of this sort of combining of the innovation function with the CDC function to get folks thinking more nimbly internally and also being more comfortable looking externally to partner. The other is reaching out to other utilities and finding vectors to collaborate multilaterally to kind of move some of these rules that are making it so challenging to engage with startups in a way that's going to make sense between the 2 business models.
So the regulated model puts up some barriers. And I was just wondering, if you think about high tech and life sciences, they have their own barriers. Are there any other barriers that you think of when you think of some of these early stage energy tech companies and clean tech companies? Emily, I see you're shaking your head. So what are some of the other barriers you witness for these companies that might differentiate them from other sectors?
So the interesting thing is, I mean, maybe it's because where we're positioned is sitting right next to MIT and Harvard and 50 other universities, but the tech isn't usually the problem. I'd say the number 1 problem we see startups struggle with is kind of the product market fit. They have a tech that they think can be applied to something, one of these problems that a utility might have or an energy major might have, but they don't necessarily have the data to actually know that that's a real market. And so that's something that we work with our corporate partners quite closely to help them have that real market data to actually push their technology in the right direction. I'd say the second thing that they struggle with is just investment capital in this field is tough. Silicon Valley declared clean tech was dead back around 2008. We're still recovering from that. And there were a lot of investments that probably weren't very smart. When you're building a factory in Silicon Valley to make solar panels, I mean, who thought that was a good idea? But that mentality that clean tech is not a place to invest is still out there. And just recently, I'd say within the last 6 months or so, we've started to see some funds really start up again around this area, and it's been very exciting to see. And one in our area is the Clean Energy Ventures Group just raised a $110 million fund to invest in early stage clean tech, and I've seen a few others over the last 6 months or so. So the investment capital, and then the 2 things I've mentioned already, building relationships with corporate partners. We do special work in that area to make sure that those relationships can happen. And then finally, actually manufacturing something is another thing that startups struggle with.
Wade, Ben, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I would echo the idea that, I mean, the change factors from a company perspective, and Emily definitely touched on that, is sort of maybe shifting a bit from looking what's been successful, really successful in clean tech, is scaling up fairly standardized things like the LED light bulb and silicon solar panels and now lithium-ion batteries. And then the business models that have flourished around that have been put more of an emphasis on maybe software and coordination and business. So I think that's been a big change, and one that jives better with venture capital, to be honest, because you can leave the low margin, really challenging stuff to large industry, and they're really good at that. The other thing I would say is that you're seeing not only utilities who are normally sort of pokey, so most European utilities have a corporate VC at this point because they're so far ahead of us in terms of their disruption. You're seeing a wave of it in the US, certainly we're somewhere in the middle of that. But not only us, but automotive companies, oil and gas, they're all sort of getting pushed by their shareholders to have an answer to what happens to this drumbeat of not only sort of climate change, but digitalization and all the challenges to business model output.
That's a great segue to you, if you don't mind me.
Sure.
So Plug and Play just opened up their Houston what do you call it?
Office.
Office? Okay, it's an office. That's simple. So you just opened up that office. Can you tell us about that and who
Sure.
you're working with there? And because that's obviously with a lot
Absolutely.
of oil players, I'm
Yeah.
assuming.
Yeah, so just to close out on a couple of points here, which I thought it was spot on. Most of the startups that have brilliant ideas and are targeting utilities as their go-to-market strategy, sometimes they don't really consider the addressable target market may not be as compelling to an investor that's looking for venture great returns. We've come across numerous ideas in Silicon Valley that can aggregate data from different assets and utilities and come up with new metrics that can inform dialogues for operating the assets much more efficiently. However, even in the best case scenario, the exit strategy for these companies may not be as compelling for a traditional investor, but not maybe other corporate investors. And the point that Emily mentioned, we started our energy practice at the same time we started an insurance program. And this is to the point of the nature of the business. And now we're working with nearly 90 of the largest insurance and reinsurance companies around the world where they're heavily investing in technologies that can better understand risk and proactively come up with insights to their customers that can be utilities, that can be asset owners, builders, construction companies to mitigate risk of fires or floods or break-ins. So we see a lot more dynamic in some of the other industries that revolve around data, but energy industry hasn't really embraced that yet enough, I would say. I mean, in the past 2 years, things have changed, and that's partly why we're in Houston. A lot of the partners that we have, likes of Chevron, Exxon, Phillips 66, and others, who've seen the changes and are trying to invest in the emerging energy markets, now want to bring these innovative ideas to their homes and headquarters, where they're, again, another point that Ben mentioned, the biggest challenge in this whole journey, I would say 80% of the challenge is to culturally embrace change and get the internal buy-ins and align the constituents to kind of expedite this process in the energy space, and we haven't got there yet. So we also similarly putting a good amount of work to educate these leaders in the energy space that there needs to be some sandboxes, whether it's technology sandboxes, regulatory sandboxes, similar to what the European countries have done. Great partners that we have in Europe that can quickly do 50 or 60 pilot projects a year and use that as a short-term success to build on the future of their energy business. But we're starting to see that in the US. We're excited to see that, and that's partly why we're in Houston.
And from a climate risk perspective, I love you bringing up the insurance companies and the reinsurance companies. Are you seeing that they're demanding in certain cases that certain technologies put in place if they're going to ensure that?
I think it's a mix of both pull and push because we didn't really have to be so concerned about it until like the recent catastrophes in California, wildfires, and our partners having to go through a lot of financial burdens until like they started convening sessions with these insurance providers, and we realized that insurance actually have strong business in the energy space, and this is a mutually interesting opportunities for the stakeholders to come around the table and do joint development agreements.
So I just want to check. I have lots of questions. I could keep going, but can I get a show of hands for people who have questions? Can you raise your hand if you're going to have a question? 2, 3, okay. So let me ask a final question, and we'll go to you guys and whoever else. So I like to always ask this if I have anyone who's sort of in the investment arena or looking at a lot of early stage companies. Putting on, looking in your crystal balls, if you look out 3 to 5 years, let's not go 10 because I think that's too far. 3 to 5 years, let's just go down. What are you most excited about in either the energy or grid related sectors? And you can pick 1 or 2 or 3.
Yeah, I'm a little biased coming from Silicon Valley, and I would say 90% of the investments we made are driven by applications of AI, machine learning, and software analytics to enhance the operations with the current and existing hardware assets. But I think the intersection of, our friend from Johnson's Control mentioned that the intersection of the real estate and energy, as well as the intersection of transportation and energy, I think are the most exciting things, at least from my perspective and the flow of startups that we're looking at.
Great.
Yeah, so I'm going to say one that will be obvious, which is obviously energy storage. We need to make that cheaper, and we need to do it quickly. And so that's an area that I would expect a lot of progress to be made in the next 3 years. The other one may be surprising, and that's hydrogen, or green hydrogen, as some folks like to call it. I think that's an area that is kind of overlooked right now, that there is a lot of activity in. And I know in our area, they just kind of pulled up the last barrier to hydrogen mobility, which was in our area that you couldn't send hydrogen vehicles through tunnels. You can. That was really the last barrier. Now, at least in our incubator, we have a hydrogen refueling station startup that is cheaper, faster, better, but I know the infrastructure is being built in many places, and it's a lower carbon alternative, so I think it's going to get some play. There's a lot of big OEM vehicle companies that are backing this, so really interesting to see where that goes.
And this was mentioned earlier, but are you thinking green hydrogen as in electrolysis from solar and wind, and then putting it into the pipelines and using it in various ways? Okay. Great. I think I wanted to ask about that, but it's a really interesting area. It can also be put into power plants, so there's different ways you could use it.
Lots of good ones to choose from. I would echo the AI machine learning point and just put a little bit of a twist on it in that I think the first wave of a lot of that investment has been simply the things that you can do assuming the data. I think there's a whole other level of perfecting how you source data, how you get a continuous stream of data to continue to train those AIs. So whether it's using sound, whether it's drones, where I think there's almost everyone seems to have a drone company of some kind, software company. But I think that's the right sort of next direction for the tremendous potential that has. The other thing I would say is technologies that allow distributed resources to actively provide value to support the grid. I think there's a ton of potential there, and I think a lot of businesses are heading in that direction.
So integration.
Yeah.
All right, so let's go, was it over here? Did we have a question?
Sure.
Yeah.
This is actually more for Ben. I'm curious on the sort of difficulties of regulated utilities versus, sounds like the partners is an unregulated piece, and so do you have a tendency, do you move innovative things outside the utilities so that you have more freedom there? And is that kind of the model? And if so, how do you do that when you have the inventors who are kind of coming up with the idea because of utility need?
So we technically sit within corporate development. All of our investments do sit sort of in a, we can't just have the regulated business sign contracts with startups because we happen to have a stake in them. We're very careful about that. In terms of developing technologies in-house, we will look to commercialize in some instances, so to spin that outside where we see more of a market. I think if that was developed with regulated assets, that becomes regulated folks, that becomes a very careful conversation around how much is due back to the ratepayer or the customers and the folks who have been supporting that work. So that is a bit delicate. It just becomes a lot less problematic when really what we're trying to do is identify a problem within the regulated business, sussing out whether there's a startup that can, or a technology company that can come in and engage. Often it's sort of a middle ground where we have to do a bit of innovating from the utility side in terms of, well, what's the program structure to actually unlock that value? So plenty to do before you get to there. We're also, there have been some really neat innovations internally that we're looking to spin out, but it's a case-by-case thing, I suppose. Sure.
Over here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I like the barriers discussion. I have my experiences with two other barriers that I'd just like to throw out, see what your experience is doing. Emily mentioned market data. And one of the other barriers I've found with the startup is market experience. And I really advocate early on for startups to handpick a few industry people who have a lot of experience in that industry and bring them on early on to make sure that the decisions that they make, the startup makes, are really aligned, so they don't reinvent the wheel or they don't do something that people know doesn't work, but they don't have experience in that. And the second one is corporate partnerships. At GE, when we partner with a startup, many startups, most of them do not understand industry standards. And they develop their technology with very proprietary ways of doing things. And then we want to partner with them, we want to integrate their technology with ours, and it's virtually impossible to do because it's all proprietary based. If early on they would have had the guidance of what the key industry standards are that they should implement in their technology, it'd be a piece of cake then for us to take their products and integrate it in with ours. So those are two barriers that I'm...
Any thoughts from everyone
So
on barriers?
we address that through the accelerator program I talked about, which is Greentown Launch. And really that's a program all about building the relationships that are needed to form partnerships between startups and corporate partners. And what we do during that 6-month program is we have the startups really work with the corporates very closely, but through multiple different levels of the corporation. So usually it is the CEO level is involved, but also the business unit heads, as we talked about, and as well some of the technical staff, and then also the VC folks who are important as well, but may not have all the information the technical people have. And over the course of 6 months, we do 3 workshops, and really we're training both the startups and the corporates on both sides to be able to communicate with one another. IP is something that often comes up, how do you handle that? Also, how do you do a complex sale? But having the 2 partners working together, usually working for the startup towards milestones that they set, and then the corporate kind of gets to watch how they progress along those milestones, engaging at multiple points, that's what it takes. It's not something you can learn overnight. It's a relationship you need to build. And so we really try to foster that at Greentown because, at the end of the day, these are companies that are going to need to work with large partners to get their technology to scale.
Yeah, those are the questions we ask entrepreneurs all the time as a part of our angel vetting mechanism to see whether or not they're building up those expertise in that industry they're targeting. And the second fold to our approach to that is we make 50 or 60 of large corporations, whichever industry they're trying to tap into, we make them available to the startups and quickly realize whether or not they should focus on that industry. So that's kind of like a way to do it much cheaper and far more expedient for all parties involved. And if they realize that they don't have the industry knowledge, they better off focus on some other industries.
Agree.
Okay, good. Good. Okay. Steve?
Yeah, Emily, I was just going to ask you this question because with your focus more on hardware, at least my own experience over the years is that hardware is both expensive to scale, to take to market, but it's also easy to commoditize by competitors. And so it just is always thought of, at least for me, it's been always thought of as being a much higher risk investment.
I'd say a lot of investors feel the same way. Which is why you need a Greentown Labs. And what we do is help to really reduce a lot of the cost that otherwise, and really a lot of the risk that startups that are early stage and doing this kind of hardware development would ordinarily face. We work with them to partner with them partner them with manufacturers who can also often work with them from the time that they're kind of in a machine shop stage all the way to light volume production, so that instead of going and building something where they actually have to set this up themselves, they're working with partners that we know actually know how to work with startups. And so it really lowers their costs overall to be working with an incubator that can help with many of those risks associated with hardware. Because a lot of the risk also is just, can you really make it at scale? I mean, that's kind of the name of the game. And oftentimes if you've made one, it doesn't mean you can make 10,000 that have a cost that is meaningful and is actually going to help you get to market.
Any other questions? Great, we'll take one more.
This might be a somewhat unfair question, but for the utility investors, how often have you come across opportunities, or what would you do if you came across an opportunity where you could invest in a technology that could essentially uproot the existing utility business model, which basically threatens the current bread and butter in exchange for a potentially game-changing technology?
Yeah. I assume that was directed at me. So, do you have? It sounds like you might have something in mind. So, give me an example.
I mean,
We'll buy it and stick it in a dark closet somewhere. No, I'm just kidding. Sorry, what were you going to say? I'm genuinely curious. So, would this be like
what kind of
DG
technology?
solar, something like that? Is that sort of what you had in?
I mean, think about bidirectionality and how that could essentially change how we interact with the grid. Bidirectional mobility, for example, could essentially just
So
uproot the way generation is done, and also the way the utility could essentially become just a platform for transactive services.
Right. Right.
It could literally change the business models.
No, I mean, we're very mindful of that potential for change. So National Grid doesn't own generation, and so I mean, we own a small bit, and then we have a large-scale renewable developer on the non-regulated side, but sort of avoids maybe a bit of those types of problems. Look, I would say that we have made investments in distributed energy companies. We made an investment in LEAP, which is an asset-light grid services monetization platform. So the idea that they partner with Tesla and other folks that have already sort of aggregated large numbers of devices and customers, and then they can monetize that in bulk energy markets. Really sort of the idea of grid edge supplanting a lot of the functions of the centralized generation system, which is sort of what you're talking about. We've also invested in Omnidian, which is a performance guarantee product, an O&M product, automated through software for DG Solar. And by the way, there's like 3 other utility companies that have also invested in them. I think what I would say is that you're seeing a real convergence of companies from the DG side pivoting a bit from saying like utilities suck and we're going to make them go the way of the dinosaur. So Sunrun's last presentation says we're not trying to disrupt the utility, we're trying to displace it, and this is a cost-effective solution to a lot of the problems that the utilities are facing. On the other side, I would say like look at what AES announced with Google, or I think it was Ørsted and Microsoft. This idea of or Invenergy Edge. It's like all these large-scale renewable companies are suddenly looking at the demand side of the meter and saying we have to optimize this because our customers are asking for it. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's coming from both sides in a way that everyone realizes there's a benefit to looking at what assets are in the ground and how to optimize that. I fully would allow that there's a way to leapfrog building old generation where it doesn't exist in the developing world, et cetera. But we so far haven't had to cross that bridge. I don't think that we would see it as a threat to our assets either.
And that's a plug for a keynote tomorrow with Christina Skierka, who's going to talk about Utility 2.0 in the developing world. Great. Before we wrap up, I love that vision, by the way. Before we wrap up, real quick, just go down. Name one, because you guys are working with companies. Name one company you really like right now, an early stage company. Is that fair? Mm-hmm. Can we start with you, Wade?
Sure. I mean, it's just unfair because we look at several thousand companies every year, but one of the ones that I like is called WeaveGrid, that aggregates data from the transformers, the electric vehicle, as well as the grid itself, and kind of runs it through their algorithms. And identifies and prevents blow-ups in the transformers.
Weave grid.
Weave grid,
Okay, you
yeah.
guys all got that. Great. Okay, next.
Okay, Line Vision. And this is a company that is basically helping us to monitor transmission lines. And as probably many of you in this room know, transmission lines really aren't monitored in the majority of the cases. And this technology is IoT-based, and it's really providing real-time data and knowledge of transmission lines. And if you look at where that might have been helpful, PG&E, if they had known which lines needed to be shut down, we could have kept the entire, top of the grid from going, needing to turn everything off at once. So Line Vision is the company.
I'll stick with Omnidian solar performance guarantees. I think the other interesting thing about Omnidian is that they've really had to be very disciplined about making customer outreach both better experience than it was before and much leaner. And so we're learning a lot of things as a utility about how proactive customer communication might be beneficial. Lot of good knowledge transfer there.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, join me in thanking them for this great discussion. Real quick, we're going to take a break, go enjoy a drink, get phone calls in, get some fresh air. Back here at 3:45, we got a point-counterpoint on policies.
bet
It's
you
going
have
to
some
be
of these.
Dem, Republican,
yes.
and then Bill Ritter with a final keynote. Thank you.